There are places in the Hyborian world where men go to seek treasure, and there are others. They enter only because hunger, war, or pride leaves them no choice. Khar-Vorak was one of the latter. For generations, travelers spoke of the fortress as a place without an open gate. Its towers stood above the northern hills, blackened by weather, with no banners flying from their walls. No merchant traded there, no clan claimed it. Those who approached too closely were driven away by armed men, and those who asked who ruled the fortress were given the same answer. Vargan. Once, he had been a warrior of no great renown. He had owned no crown, commanded no army, and ruled no land beyond the loyalty of a few hard men who followed him into battle. Then, he found something beneath the dead. It was no sword, no golden idol, and no weapon fit for a king. It was a small black amulet, smooth as polished stone, lying in the earth beneath the bodies of men who had died generations before he was born. It gave off a faint light. Vargan took it anyway. Years later, the people who had once called him brother would lower their eyes when he passed. They would work until their hands bled, build walls they were forbidden to leave, and whisper prayers that the king would never hear. And behind those walls, Vargan would become something no man had intended to create. The old records do not agree on what the amulet was. They agree on something else. It changed him, slowly. So slowly that those around him did not understand what they were witnessing until it was too late. This is the forgotten story of Vargan, the warrior who became king. The king who imprisoned his own people, and the fortress he built to make certain that no one could ever escape. But the oldest chronicles end with one final detail. Many years after Khar-Vorak was closed, a lone barbarian came to its gates, and for the first time in a generation, someone entered the fortress without fear of the king. Before Khar-Vorak had walls, towers, or a name feared by the clans of the north, there was only a stretch of hard earth where several war bands had met beneath a winter sky. Vargan had not gone there seeking anything. He had gone to kill men. That was the way of his people. A feud between two clans had grown into a larger quarrel, and by the time the warriors met on the frozen plain, none could remember which insult had begun it. Men remembered only the dead who needed avenging. Vargan had brought 30 warriors with him, and he expected to return with fewer. The battle lasted until the snow beneath their feet had turned brown. There was little triumph in it. Of the 30 men who had followed him that morning, 11 remained standing. Vargan walked among the dead after nightfall, searching for those who might still breathe. He found one man alive beneath the body of a stranger and carried him back toward the fires. Then he heard something beneath the ground. At first he thought it was the wind. He stopped. The sound came again, a faint vibration beneath his boots. There was no movement on the plain. The surviving warriors were gathered around their fires, and the horses stood quietly in the dark. Vargan knelt. He pressed one blood-covered hand against the earth. The vibration stopped. He almost returned to the camp. Then he saw the light. It came from beneath a dead warrior several paces away. Vargan dragged the body aside. Underneath was frozen soil, dark with old blood. He dug with his sword until the blade struck stone. The stone was not part of the battlefield. It had been buried. He cleared the earth with both hands and found a narrow opening between two ancient slabs. There were marks carved into them, but the symbols belonged to no clan he knew. Vargan widened the opening. Beneath it was a small chamber. The air that rose from below was strangely warm. He lowered himself inside. There were no bones, no treasure, no weapons, only a single object resting on a flat stone. It was an amulet, small enough to fit inside his palm. Black, perfectly smooth. No chain had survived around it, though 2 narrow holes suggested that it had once been worn by someone long ago. Its surface seemed to swallow the firelight from Vargan's torch. Then it began to glow. Not brightly, not enough to illuminate the chamber. It was merely a faint red light beneath the black surface, like a coal hidden beneath ash. Vargan stared at it for a long time. A sensible man would have left it where it lay. But Vargan had never been a sensible man. He had spent his life believing that anything a stronger man could take belonged to the man strong enough to claim it. So he reached for the amulet. The instant his fingers touched it, the warmth vanished. The chamber became cold. Vargan heard a voice. He could not understand the words. He was not even certain they had been spoken. Then the light disappeared. He closed his hand around the amulet and climbed back toward the surface. No one saw him take it. That mattered, because if the other warriors had seen what Vargan carried from beneath the dead, the story might have ended there. Instead, he hid the amulet beneath his leather tunic. By dawn, the dead had been burned and the survivors were preparing to leave. Vargan said nothing about the chamber. He said nothing about the strange warmth beneath the earth. He said nothing about the voice. He simply mounted his horse and rode home. For several days, nothing changed. Then Vargan noticed that his wound had closed. The cut across his shoulder should have taken weeks to heal. Instead, only a dark line remained. His companions called it good fortune. Vargan did not correct them. He began sleeping with the amulet beneath his head. He dreamed of a mountain. In every dream, the mountain was hollow. There were doors inside it, hundreds of them. Behind each door stood a figure that Vargan could never see clearly. And somewhere beneath them all, something waited. He always woke before reaching it. The dreams became more frequent. So did the victories. Vargan returned to war before his wound had fully faded. Men who had fought beside him for years began to notice that he was different. He no longer tired during long marches. He could carry weights that had once required 2 men. In battle, wounds that should have slowed him seemed to trouble him less each time. He began winning. Then he began taking. One clan after another bent beneath his sword. At first, the people praised him. They called him strong. They called him chosen. They said the old gods had favored him. Vargan listened, and somewhere beneath his tunic, the black amulet grew warm. He did not yet know what it wanted, but he had begun to understand what it could give him, and that was enough. If you want to follow the forgotten lives, kingdoms, artifacts, and decisions that shape the darkest legends of the Hyborian Age, subscribe to the Lost Chronicles of Hyboria. The chronicles are long, and this was only the first thing Vargan found beneath the dead. Vargan did not become king in a single battle. There was no crown placed upon his head while men shouted his name, and no old priest declaring that the gods had chosen him. It happened more quietly than that. One clan surrendered, then another. The men who had once fought beside him began bringing their sons to his camp, hoping to earn a place among his warriors. Chiefs who had mocked him years before now offered horses, women, iron, and food in exchange for his protection. Vargan accepted everything. He rarely returned anything. The amulet remained beneath his clothing. He wore it day and night. Sometimes during the long marches between battles, he would feel it moving against his chest, although the cord around his neck had not shifted. At other times, it became so cold that his skin went numb around it. He never removed it. He had begun to believe that the object belonged to him. That belief was the first thing it took from him. The second was sleep. Vargan stopped resting for more than a few hours at a time. He would wake before dawn and sit alone beside the fire while the rest of his men slept. He began staring into the flames for long periods without speaking. One of his oldest companions, a warrior named Khar-Vorak, noticed. "You are not sleeping." Vargan looked at him. "I do not need to." Khar-Vorak laughed at first. Then he saw Vargan's face. There was something wrong with his eyes. Not enough to frighten him, not yet, but enough that Khar-Vorak never asked again. The victories continued. Vargan conquered the northern clans one by one, until there were few men left willing to challenge him. Those who resisted were killed. Those who surrendered were ordered to kneel. Eventually, the chiefs gathered before him. They had come expecting demands. Instead, Vargan gave them a crown. Not to one of them, to himself. He had a smith melt down the ornaments taken from defeated chiefs and forge a simple band of blackened iron. It was placed upon his head in silence. Vargan became king. The people celebrated because they had learned that kings were easier to survive when they were pleased. For the first years of his reign, Vargan was not a cruel ruler. That was what made the later years harder to understand. He built roads, he ordered wells dug, he brought captured cattle back to villages that had lost their herds. He punished thieves and raiders. He even opened the borders of his new kingdom to merchants who had once avoided the northern clans. People began telling stories about him. They said Vargan had united a land that had never known peace. They said his strength had saved them. They said his kingdom would last for generations. Vargan believed them. Then the amulet began to change him. The first visible sign appeared on his left hand. A dark line formed beneath the skin of his palm. It looked like a vein. Within months, more appeared. Vargan covered them with gloves. When his physicians examined him, he ordered them to remain silent. One physician did not. He told Vargan that the discoloration was spreading. The king killed him before sunset. After that, no one examined the king without permission. The people noticed other things. Vargan stopped eating with his court. He stopped appearing at public feasts. He stopped allowing anyone to touch him. Even his closest warriors were ordered to remain several steps away whenever he spoke. He said it was for their protection. No one asked, from what? Then came the first disappearance. A young servant was sent into the king's chamber carrying wine. He never came out. The guards said they had heard nothing. By morning, the servant was gone. Vargan said the man had fled. No one believed him, but no one challenged him either. The king's isolation increased. He moved his chambers into the deepest part of the palace and ordered stone walls built around them. The amulet was always with him. At night, the servants heard him speaking. Sometimes they heard another voice answering. Sometimes there was only silence. Then came the order that changed the kingdom. Vargan announced that a new fortress would be built in the northern mountains. He chose the place himself. A black ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The mountain beneath it was solid enough to support enormous walls, and the surrounding cliffs made escape difficult. He called the fortress Khar-Vorak. At first, The people thought it would be a monument to his reign. They were wrong. Thousands of men, women, and children were ordered to work. Stone had to be cut from the mountain. Trees had to be dragged from the forests. Iron had to be carried for miles. The king gave no explanation for the scale of the construction. The walls grew higher, then higher still. Years passed. The people who had once celebrated Vargan's victories began to understand what they were building. Khar-Vorak had no great market, no royal gardens, no comfortable houses for the people. Its towers faced inward. Its gates were designed to close from both sides. The roads leading toward the mountains were blocked by walls and armed posts. Vargan had not built a fortress to keep an enemy outside. He had built one to keep his own people inside. By then his hands had changed. The black veins had spread past his wrists. His skin had become harder. His face looked thinner, darker, and beneath the Black Amulet, something seemed to pulse against his chest. Vargan no longer spoke of his kingdom. He spoke of his possession. "The people are mine." The words became an order, then a law, and finally, the only truth that mattered inside Khar-Vorak. The king had conquered his enemies. Now he had decided to conquer everyone else. And the fortress was only the beginning. The first families entered Khar-Vorak, believing they would leave when the work was finished. That belief lasted about a year. The fortress had grown around them slowly. At first, there had been only scaffolds, trenches, and piles of stone. Men worked from sunrise until the last light disappeared behind the mountains. Women carried water and food to the stonecutters. Children gathered scraps of wood and hauled smaller pieces of rock. They were told that once the fortress was complete, they would return to their villages. Vargan never intended to let them return. The first gate was enormous. It had been built into the mountain itself, wide enough for 20 horses to pass side by side. Beyond it stood a second gate, then a third. Each could be closed independently. There was no road through the fortress. There was only a road into it. When the final stones were set into place, Vargan ordered the outer camps destroyed. The people watched their old homes burn from the walls. No one understood why. Some tried to protest. A few demanded to see the king. They never reached him. Vargan had stopped appearing in public altogether. Orders came through his guards. Food was distributed according to work. Movement was controlled. Families were separated whenever the king's officials decided they were too closely related to men who had resisted him. The people began to disappear into different parts of the fortress. Some worked in the quarries. Some carried stone. Others maintained the fires, repaired weapons, or cleaned the endless corridors. The strongest men became guards. The weakest were sent underground. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing there. The deeper levels of Khar-Vorak were forbidden. That only made people curious. Rumors spread among the workers. Some said Vargan was building a tomb. Others said he had found gold beneath the mountain. One old mason claimed the king had ordered an entire chamber carved from solid rock because he had seen something beneath the fortress that frightened him. The mason disappeared the next morning. After that, people stopped speaking openly. Years passed. Khar-Vorak became a city without freedom. Children were born inside its walls and grew up believing the outside world was a story. They knew forests only from the wood brought through the gates. They knew rivers from the water stored in stone cisterns. They knew freedom only as something their grandparents remembered. And above them all lived Vargan, the man who had once walked among warriors, now remained alone. He had stopped wearing the iron crown. It no longer fit. His body had changed too much. His shoulders had broadened, his neck had thickened. His fingers were longer than before, with dark nails that no smith could explain. His skin had become almost gray in places. But the worst change was his face. The features were still recognizable. That was what frightened those who saw him. It was still Vargan, only less human. He spent most of his time in a chamber beneath the fortress. The chamber was built around the place where the mountain descended deepest into the earth. At its center stood a stone pedestal. The Black Amulet rested upon it. Sometimes Vargan would stand before it for hours. Sometimes he would whisper to it. Sometimes he would scream. The guards outside heard all of it. They were forbidden to enter. One night, something happened that changed the way they looked at their king forever. A guard named Terran heard a crash from below. Then another. Then a sound like stone being dragged across stone. He opened the inner door. He saw Vargan standing in the darkness. The king's back was toward him. For several seconds, Terran did not recognize what he was looking at. Vargan had grown larger. His shoulders were almost too wide for the chamber. His arms hung lower than they should have. His hands reached almost to his knees. The guard raised his sword. Vargan turned. Terran dropped the weapon. The king's eyes were black, not dark, black. There was no visible white around them. Vargan looked at the man for a long moment. Then he said his name. Terran. The god froze. The voice was still human. That made it worse. Terran backed away. Vargan took one step toward him. The guard ran. He did not stop until he reached the upper halls. He told the others what he had seen. They laughed at him, until they saw his face. After that night, the king's guards doubled. No one entered the lower chambers again, and Vargan became a rumor even inside his own fortress. People began calling him the Black King. They said he no longer slept. They said he ate only raw meat. They said he could hear anyone who spoke. His name. Some believed the amulet had made him immortal. Others believed it was slowly killing him. Nobody knew, but everyone could see the changes. Every year, Vargan became less recognizable. His skin darkened, his teeth sharpened, his spine began to curve, his voice grew deeper, and the strange light inside the amulet became brighter. The people were terrified. But fear alone was not enough to keep Khar-Vorak closed. So Vargan made sure they had nowhere else to go. He ordered the last, open passage through the mountains sealed. The gates were reinforced, the towers were raised, and guards were placed along every wall. The fortress became a prison, not for an enemy army, for an entire people. By then, the old men who remembered Vargan before the crown were nearly all dead. Their children knew only the king they feared, and their children would know even less. The man who had once united the clans had disappeared behind stone. The kingdom he had built no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the thing beneath the mountain. And somewhere in the darkness below, Khar-Vorak, the Black Amulet, continued to glow. By the time the second generation was born inside Khar-Vorak, no one remembered what Vargan's voice had sounded like when he was a young man. The old stories disagreed. Some said he had once laughed loudly. Others claimed he had been quiet even before the amulet. A few remembered him as a hard but fair warrior who had shared meat with his men after battle. Those memories became difficult to believe. The king no longer showed himself. His orders came through messengers who never entered his chamber without a guard standing behind them. Even the men closest to him avoided looking directly at his face. There were reasons for that. Vargan had changed too much. The blackness beneath his skin had spread across his chest and neck. The flesh around his shoulders had become thick and uneven, as though something beneath it was growing in places it should not. His hands were no longer the hands of a man. The fingers were longer. The joints were larger. The nails had become hard and dark. Yet Vargan remained conscious. That was the cruelest part. He knew what was happening to him. He simply refused to believe it was happening against his will. The amulet had become his explanation for everything. When his body changed, he called it strength. When his mind became restless, he called it wisdom. When he began hearing voices in empty rooms, he called them visions. And when people began fearing him, he called that respect. The fortress changed with him. Vargan ordered entire sections rebuilt. The ceilings of the lower chambers were raised. Doors were widened. Corridors were reinforced with thicker stone. No one understood why until the first guard saw him walking through one of the unfinished halls. He was taller, not by much, but enough to make the old measurements useless. He had stopped wearing armor. Nothing made for a human body fit him anymore. The guards began hearing him at night. His footsteps traveled through the stone, slow, heavy, regular, one step, then another. Sometimes they continued for hours. Other nights there was nothing. Then came the screams. The first time, everyone believed someone was being tortured. The second time, they thought prisoners had escaped. By the third, no one went looking. The screams came from beneath the fortress. They always stopped before dawn. Vargan began ordering more animals brought into Khar-Vorak. Cattle, horses, dogs, anything that could provide meat. The royal stores emptied faster than before. When the food became scarce, the king ordered hunting parties beyond the walls. The hunters returned with whatever they could find, but they were not allowed to approach the lower fortress. The king wanted the meat delivered to the gates and left there. Some servants claimed they had seen what remained afterward. Bones, nothing else. Vargan's hunger had changed. It was no longer the hunger of a man. The people began to understand that their king was not simply ill. Something was replacing him. Still, nobody knew what to do. There were thousands inside Khar-Vorak, but the fortress was built to prevent rebellion. Weapons were controlled. The strongest men were watched. Families were threatened. The children of prisoners could be taken as punishment for the actions of their parents. Every possible road out had been destroyed. Vargan had spent decades preparing for the day his people might turn against him. He had been preparing for the wrong enemy. One winter morning, a group of workers found a section of the eastern wall, covered in strange black marks. They looked like cracks at first. Then one man touched them. The stone was warm. He pulled his hand away. The marks were spreading. By nightfall, the cracks had reached the foundations. The next morning, Vargan ordered the entire section buried beneath fresh stone. No explanation was given. The workers obeyed. That became the way Khar-Vorak survived. Whenever something strange appeared, they covered it. Whenever someone disappeared, they forgot the name. Whenever the king changed, they pretended not to notice. Fear became ordinary. That was how the fortress endured. Not because its walls were impossible to break, because the people inside had been taught that escape was impossible. Then one evening, An old woman was brought before the king. She had been accused of refusing to work. She was nearly 80 years old. She had been born outside the fortress. She was one of the last people alive who remembered the world before Khar-Vorak. Vargan came to see her himself. For the first time in many years, he walked into one of the upper halls. The woman looked at him. She did not kneel. The guards demanded that she lower her head. She refused. Vargan stared at her. Then the old woman spoke. "I remember you." The guards went silent. Vargan moved closer. The woman looked at the blackened skin around his face. "You were a man once." For several moments, nothing happened. Then Vargan smiled. It was not a human smile. The woman did not look away. "You found something beneath the dead," she said. The king stopped. No one had spoken of the amulet. Not for years. The woman continued. "And now it has found you." Vargan killed her with his bare hand. Afterward, he returned to the lower chambers. He stood before the Black Amulet for a long time. His hands were shaking. For the first time, he seemed afraid. Not of his people, not of an enemy, of himself. He reached toward the amulet. The moment his fingers touched it, the faint red light returned. But this time, it was brighter. Much brighter. The chamber filled with it. Vargan closed his eyes, and somewhere beneath Khar-Vorak, something answered. That night, every dog in the fortress began howling. By morning, 3 guards were missing, and for the first time, the people of Khar-Vorak heard something moving beneath their feet. It was not the king walking through the halls. It was something much larger. Something that had been growing in the dark. Something that had been waiting for Vargan to become what it needed him to be. The sound beneath the fortress continued for 7 nights. It moved through the stone, like something searching for a way out. During the day, the workers pretended not to hear it. At night, they locked their doors and pushed whatever furniture they had against them. No one slept well. The guards were worse. They had weapons, but nobody knew what they were supposed to fight. A man could be killed. An army could be fought. But how did a man fight something he could hear beneath his feet without ever seeing it? Then the disappearances began. 2 quarry workers vanished first, then 4 guards, then an entire group of men sent into the lower tunnels. Vargan ordered the tunnels sealed. The order came too late. Something had already entered the upper levels. The first person to see it was a young guard named Edric. He was standing beside a torch near one of the eastern corridors when he heard breathing behind him. He turned. At first he saw nothing. Then 2 black eyes appeared beyond the torchlight. Edric raised his spear. The creature stepped forward. It was Vargan, or what remained of him. He had grown far larger than any ordinary man. His shoulders were broad enough to fill the corridor, and his arms hung heavily at his sides. His skin had lost almost all of its human color. It was dark gray, almost black in places, with hard ridges running beneath it. His face still carried traces of the King Edric had once seen from a distance. But the mouth had changed. The teeth were longer. The jaw was heavier, and the eyes were completely black. Edric did not attack. He dropped his spear. Vargan looked at him. For one brief moment, something human returned to his face. "Go!" The guard could not move. Vargan growled. "Go!" Edric ran. He never looked back. By sunrise, everyone knew. The king was no longer human. But there was something stranger than fear in the fortress that morning. Relief. For years, the people had feared Vargan as a cruel ruler. Now they understood that the man who had imprisoned them was gone. What remained was a beast wearing his body. Some wanted to rebel, others wanted to flee. But Khar-Vorak was still there. The gates remained shut. The walls remained guarded, and the men who controlled the fortress were terrified enough to obey whatever came from below. Vargan disappeared into the lower levels. He no longer gave orders through messengers. Instead, the guards began finding instructions carved into stone. No one knew who had written them. They were simple. Food, more food. No one enters the lower halls. No one opens the eastern gate. No one leaves. The king had become a prisoner of his own fortress, but he still remembered one thing: the amulet. It remained around his neck. Its black surface now glowed. Constantly, the red light could be seen beneath his skin. Some nights workers claimed they saw the glow moving through the walls. Others said they heard Vargan speaking to something underground. The words were never clear, but there was one phrase that several people remembered. Not yet. The fortress endured another decade, then another. The people changed. The king changed. The outside world changed. Khar-Vorak became a forgotten place. Travelers stopped coming near the mountains. The clans that had once feared Vargan were replaced by younger kingdoms farther south. New wars began. New kings ruled. New roads were built. Nobody remembered why Khar-Vorak had been built. It became a place spoken of only by old hunters. They said there was a black fortress in the northern mountains. They said nobody came out. They said something lived inside. Most people laughed at the stories. The mountains were too far away. The fortress was too old. The stories were too strange. Then, one summer, a group of hunters found a dead horse on a mountain trail. The animal had been torn apart. There were no wolf tracks, no bear tracks, no signs of men, only deep marks in the earth. The hunters followed them. They found the tracks leading toward Khar-Vorak. They turned back. They never returned. Years passed again. The fortress became almost completely silent. No smoke rose from its towers. No guards were seen on the walls. Yet the gates remained closed. The people inside had become fewer. Many had died. Others had been born and grown old without ever seeing the world beyond the mountains. The last generation lived in darkness. Then something unexpected happened. A child found an old tunnel beneath the western foundations. It had been forgotten for decades. The passage led toward the outside. The child returned and told his parents. They told others. For the first time in generations, the people of Khar-Vorak had discovered a possible way out. They began planning, quietly, carefully. They gathered tools. They waited for night. And when the first group entered the tunnel, they found something that stopped them cold. The passage was not abandoned. Something had been using it. There were fresh claw marks in the stone. And farther ahead in the darkness, they saw a faint red glow. The same glow that had first appeared beneath the battlefield, where Vargan had found the amulet. The people turned around. They understood then that the fortress was not merely holding the beast. The fortress had been built around it, and whatever lived beneath Khar-Vorak had never stopped growing. The tunnel was sealed again. The chance was lost. For another generation, nobody tried to escape, until the day a stranger arrived in the northern mountains. He was not searching for Khar-Vorak. He did not know the stories. He did not know Vargan's name. He was simply a barbarian traveling alone. He saw the fortress from a distant ridge, and unlike every man who had come before him, he walked toward it. The barbarian reached Khar-Vorak near sunset. He had been traveling alone for several days, following a mountain trail that had nearly disappeared beneath snow and stone. He had not come looking for the fortress. He did not know its name, and he had never heard of Vargan. What he knew was simple. He was hungry, his horse was tired, and the black walls ahead looked like shelter. He stopped on the ridge and studied them. No smoke rose from the towers. No banners moved above the battlements. There were no men visible along the walls. Yet the gates were closed. The barbarian waited. Nothing happened. He rode closer. The gates were enormous, made from black timber reinforced with iron. They had been built to withstand an army. He knocked anyway. The sound echoed through the valley. Nothing. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then he heard something behind the gate. A voice. Very faint. "Help us." The barbarian looked at the walls. He had heard many strange things during his travels. He had learned that men trapped behind walls were often more dangerous than whatever had built the walls. But he also knew what it meant when someone begged for help. He dismounted. There was a narrow opening beside the gate where part of the stone had cracked. He examined it. The crack was old. The wall was not. Someone had repaired it many times. He drew his sword. Then he began breaking the stone. It took hours. By midnight, the opening was large enough for one man. The barbarian squeezed through. He expected guards. There were none. He found a courtyard filled with abandoned weapons. The place smelled of damp stone. A few torches burned in iron brackets, but nobody tended them. Then people appeared. At first, he thought they were prisoners. They were dressed in rags and moved cautiously through the shadows. Men, women, children. They stopped when they saw him. No one spoke. The barbarian lowered his sword. An old man stepped forward. "Who are you?" The barbarian gave his name. The old man stared at him. He looked almost frightened by the answer. "You came from outside?" "Yes." The old man looked behind him, then toward the walls. "Then you are the first." The barbarian frowned. "The first? What?" "The first free man we have seen in 40 years. He did not believe him. Then he saw the people. No one wore chains. They did not need them. The fortress had done the work. The old man told him the story. He spoke of Vargan, of the wars, of the amulet, of the fortress, and of the thing that now lived beneath it." The barbarian listened without interrupting. When the old man finished, he asked one question. "Where is the king?" The old man pointed downward. The barbarian looked at the stone floor. Something moved beneath it. The sound was low enough to feel rather than hear. The people stepped away. The barbarian smiled, not because he was amused, because he had finally found something worth fighting. He descended. The lower halls were darker than the rest of the fortress. There were no torches, only the faint red glow of the amulet beneath the stone. He followed it. The passage opened into a vast chamber. At the center stood Vargan. The creature was enormous. The last pieces of the man he had once been remained only in his face. His body had become something heavy and unnatural, covered in dark flesh, hardened like stone. The Black Amulet hung from his neck. It was glowing brighter than ever. Vargan looked at the barbarian. For a moment, neither moved. Then the creature spoke. His voice was broken. "You should not be here." The barbarian tightened his grip around his sword. "I heard that before." Vargan attacked. The chamber shook. The first blow drove the barbarian across the floor. He rolled beneath the creature's arm and came up with his sword already swinging. The blade cut across Vargan's side. Black blood spilled onto the stone. The creature roared. It struck again. The barbarian barely avoided the blow. He understood. Quickly, that strength alone would not win. Vargan was stronger, larger, harder to kill, so he waited. He let the creature become angry. He let it spend its strength. And when Vargan lunged again, the barbarian moved aside. The creature struck the stone pillar behind him. The impact cracked the wall. The amulet swung forward. The barbarian saw it. He struck. The sword cut through the cord. The Black Amulet fell. For the first time, Vargan screamed like a man. The creature collapsed to its knees. Its body began to shake. The blackness beneath its skin spread rapidly across its face. The barbarian stepped closer. Vargan looked up. For one brief moment, the monster was gone. There was only an old man beneath it. His eyes were no longer black. They were tired, human. He looked at the barbarian. "How long?" The barbarian did not understand. "How long was I alone?" Then Vargan fell forward. The king was dead. The barbarian picked up the amulet. It was still warm. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he threw it into the deepest fire he could find. The black surface did not burn, so he left it beneath a slab of stone and walked away. Above him, the people waited. The barbarian reached the courtyard. He looked toward the gates. "Open them." Nobody moved. They were afraid. He walked to the mechanism himself. It took 6 men to move what Vargan had designed to be moved by 20. But eventually, the ancient gears began to turn. The gates opened. Cold mountain air entered Khar-Vorak. People stood silently. Then one woman stepped outside. She had never seen the world beyond the walls. She began to cry. Others followed. Children ran into the snow. Men who had spent their entire lives inside the fortress looked toward the mountains as though they had never seen the sky before. The barbarian did not stay to become their king. He saddled his horse. Before leaving, he looked back once at Khar-Vorak. The fortress was still standing. Its walls had survived. Its towers had survived. But the reason for which they had been built was gone. Vargan had wanted a kingdom. No one could leave. Instead, he built a prison that outlived him, and the small black amulet remained beneath the mountain, waiting. The old chronicles say the people eventually abandoned Khar-Vorak. The fortress became empty. Snow filled its courtyards. The towers cracked. The roads disappeared. But hunters who passed through those mountains sometimes claimed they could see a faint red light beneath the ruins. Most dismissed the stories. After all, Vargan was dead. The gates were open, the people were free, and whatever had been buried beneath the battlefield should have been forgotten. But the oldest version of the story ends differently. It says that when the barbarian rode away from Khar-Vorak, He carried something with him. Not the amulet, not the king's crown. A single black mark had appeared across the palm of his hand. The same mark Vargan had discovered many years before. And beneath his skin, something faintly glowed. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the age before the legends became legends, subscribe to the Lost Chronicles of Hyboria. Because some things are not destroyed when their kings die. Sometimes they simply wait for another man to find them.